Incredibly important opportunity to try to engage the residents of the city in what in many ways is one of the most important aspects of what we do at the city, which is our budget. I think it's $11.4 billion, probably more this year, that we manage. We are the largest city in Canada. In fact, our budget is probably the 6th largest budget in all of Canada. When you're looking at different governments. So it's an incredibly important budget because it impacts the residents or you, everyone in this city, in some form or the other. So it's an incredibly important document that we have been working on. And as Brad said, this is a process. We are well into the process now. And if it wasn't for this lady beside me, we would not be here today. The work that she's actually done with her financial planning staff and working with all the divisions across the city and pulling together. We do about 3 or 4 months, 2 months really, of engaged budget process, but it's actually the work that financial planning do with the divisions all across the city that enable us to really become out to the communities and start talking about what you want to see in a budget. We have a responsibility to provide an affordable budget to the citizens of this city. We have a mayor who was elected on a mandate to provide that affordability in budgets. I understand and we understand that there are a lot of people in this city that struggle on a day-to-day, week-to-week, and year-to-year basis on trying to make ends meet. We understand that we can't be providing or putting up budgets of 5% or more because people's incomes can't afford that. There's a lot of seniors who are on fixed incomes. There's a lot of people who, as I said, struggle. And so we understand that we have a responsibility to provide an affordable budget to the citizens of the city. And that's what we're attempting to do over this process. As I said, it's a fairly lengthy process, but the goal at the end of this is to provide that affordable budget. And our goal this year, working with the mayor, is to provide a budget at a 1.3% property tax increase, which is the inflation rate for this particular year. So I am confident, as is the mayor and our team, to be able to provide that. Now, as we're working through that process, we also have to understand what is important to the citizens of Toronto and what kind of things should we be investing in. And again, that is also a key priority. Now, I know we're going to be talking a lot about poverty reduction. The mayor has stated as part of this platform, it's an incredibly important part of what he's looking to do, as am I, and I think as are most of you here. So when we're looking at those kind of priorities, I can tell you that is a priority that we're going to be looking at. We have to look at other sort of investments, whether it's in transit, whether it is in the arts, whether it's in infrastructure. It's incredibly important that we look at the important targeted investments that we have to do to ensure that we have a livable, viable, and strong city. Because at the end of the day, we want to ensure that we have a city that is strong and is moving forward. So we have to look at the kind of investments that we want to actually provide the citizens. And I think tonight will be an opportunity to have that kind of dialogue on what are your priorities and what are your choices. But also understanding that as we're going through the process and when we're looking at what we're going to invest, there is an element of choosing. There's an element of priority setting and making choices. At the end of the day, we all manage our family budgets at home. And I'm sure you probably had that during Christmas. You had wish lists of things that you would like. I know my kids had a wish list of some of the things that they wanted. Well, the reality is you can't provide and you can't have everything that you may want that may be really good, but you'd have to sort of prioritize. And I think we, as we function and work with our day-to-day budgets, understand what it is about priority setting. We're no different at the city. We also have to look at what are those real important priorities. And what can we invest in today, and what maybe will we have to invest in maybe tomorrow, or the day after, or the year after. So we're going through that process. As I said, this is why it's critically important to understand what is important from you, because we have to look at investing and looking at those kind of priorities. So that's what we'll be doing, I think, a lot tonight, and we've been working through that through the process of looking at what we need to make this city great. Understanding that as we are going through this process, one of the key objectives of what we have to do, we need to be fiscally responsible and fiscally prudent. As I said, we understand that not everybody has the ability to raise their income to be able to do more. We also at the city have to look at how we are fiscally responsible and how we are managing the money that through the property taxes and many other ways you've given to us to invest on your benefit. We have to be incredibly prudent in how we manage the money. Now, as I said, no different than you manage your budgets at home, we have to do the same here in the city. And we have been doing that. And again, we will continue to do that. So we're looking at how do we save money? How do we look at, trying to do more with less is an objective we've been looking at. We've been meeting with a number of the divisions. I know Josie's going to be going through that today. But one of the objectives, and I'll give out an example, last year the mayor put out a sort of a directive to all divisions, is to find a 2% efficiencies in your division, added on top of that a 1% reduction. To sort of set that as a goal for all the divisions across the city, I forget how many we have, there's probably about 30 of them, to start working at that. So they've been working at that all during the year, and we're starting to see the results of that coming through the budget process. And there was one division that came through yesterday, MLS, and the comment from the director to us was, you know what, we took that as a challenge. Here's this, we're going to figure out how we can achieve a 2% reduction in inefficiencies, or the 1% reduction in our budgets. But we want to do that without impacting the important services that we deliver to the residents in that particular division. So they look at that as a challenge of how do we achieve, reducing our budget and looking at efficiencies, but being able to provide the services. And in fact, this division did incredibly well. It hit the targets, and in fact, they didn't even impact the services. And in fact, I think on a couple of occasions, they actually improved the services. And we kind of went, yes, that is exactly what we're looking for. We have a number of divisions that have been doing that, and we've been applauding the incredible work, and a lot of it has to do with the work that Josie's been doing all year, which is wonderful. We have other divisions who we need to do a little bit more work on. We sort of need to work a little closely with them, and that's what we're actually doing the budget process now, is figuring out how can we work to kind of, instead of just adding more bodies, adding more staff, or increasing taxes, how can we try to deliver those kind of services without adding, as opposed to, so we're looking at things like restructuring. Is there an opportunity to restructure your department? Can you look at technology? Is there a way to bring in new technologies that will enable you to deliver the services you need, but not cost as much? In fact, there are a number of divisions who have actually done that, where we've seen the results of they've implemented a certain kind of technology, and they've been able to save millions of dollars, which is when this is an example of just maybe one division, but when you add it up division all across the city, there's the potential to not only save, but to look at is how, and this is one of the goals, of course, of keeping the property tax at a reasonable rate, how can we achieve the both? It's a balance. There's give and take back and forth when you look at all across the city, but at the end of the day, I'm confident, as I think the mayor is and our committee, is to be able to bring in first of all, a balanced budget, of course, but a budget that is at 1.3%, but being able to ensure that we have the right kind of investments, poverty reduction. We're looking at the arts, we're looking at the libraries, TTC. There are a number of important priorities that we have set out that we want to achieve. And I'm confident that at the end of the process, you will see that we'll be able to achieve all of that. So, and I know Josie will be going through some of the details on what it means and how we budget, some of the numbers, so we get a sense of what it's doing. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm going to just pass it over to Josie to go through the real meat of what we've been doing, and then we'll get into the discussion afterwards.
So good evening, I'm Josie. I'm the Executive Director of Financial Planning at the City of Toronto. I work for the CFO, I work for the City Manager, and I work with the Budget Chair and the committee and all the staff to try to make this thing happen every year. And as the Councillor said, it isn't a full year process, for me at least, because just as we finish one, we're thinking about how do we start dealing with the next budget, because it is the one process we have at the city that everybody participates in, and it reflects, our financial capabilities as well as our service priorities, and so it is a really important document for us. So I have what is really an abbreviated version of what we did to the Budget Committee in December. Some of it I'll go through a little quicker, and some of it I'll slow down for where there's some key points that you need to understand. We can always come back through a Q&A if there's something you don't understand, but I'd like to go through it just so you get a sense of kind of what it is that we grapple with and what's in this budget, because they're all the moving parts of when we say how do we get to where we need to get to. So I'm going to give you a bit of a financial overview. So as the Councillor mentioned, and I think I heard earlier on as well, right? We talk about expenses, we talk about revenue. So the city has certain key revenues, that's all we have today. And this chart is just saying, okay, we have certain revenues, we have property tax, we have We have our property tax, we have our rate revenues, which is the monies we get from our garbage fees and from our water rates. We have user fees, and we have land transfer tax. And those are the revenues that the city has to deal with. And as a proportion of gross domestic product, which is basically the economic activity, is roughly about 4 or 5%. When we look at our key one, which is taxes, that's the main revenue that the city has to help support its services. It's been growing at a rate of less of inflation. And when you look at the two taxes we have, which is land transfer, which is the red one, and property tax, and then assessment, which is the year-in amount of new taxes we get, what you can see is that the red one has really been growing at quite a high rate. So if we not had that land transfer tax growing at the rate that it had, we would have been using property taxes instead, right? So it's really helped us along, and I think it helps support, I suspect, some conversation that will be happening a little bit later on this evening. And then assessment growth is when you see all the buildings bringing in new houses, new condominiums, they are now new taxpayers, right? And so that's called assessment growth, and so it's been growing, but given the number of cranes you see in the sky, it's not really been growing that much. It's about 1%. That's helped us in the last number of years. But going forward, and in this particular budget, we have identified about $100 million of new land transfer tax, but going forward in 17, 18, and so on, we are assuming that it's stabilized. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, we've got more revenue this year to deal with, particularly because of land transfer. That is helping us with our expenses, mostly with the agencies, we'll see, TTC and police. But we still have a bit of a gap, and so the direction of where we are today is looking at what additional investments, what additional savings, and what additional revenue do we need to deal with that. And that's really where the process is focusing. So for 17, what it has some implications for us next year. That slowing, we're going to see a sort of a gain slowing down in terms of how much tax we think we're going to get on the property side. Land transfer tax we think is going to be stable going forward. We all don't have a crystal ball on what's happening to the housing market, but there's lots of turmoil in the system that we're not quite sure where it's going to land. The mayor has talked about potentially a proposed levy to try to deal with capital, so should we be charging extra amount on the property tax base that we can dedicate to new infrastructure? So that's something that we're going to be talking about. And as a government, we're really dealing with fewer new dollars and we're a smaller share of the economy. So once we get past 16, we're going to be having a much larger discussion about where we're going into the future. Okay, on the expense side, and if you've been to these meetings before, you know that we have a lot of different kinds of programs, but this is a chart that's basically showing that what's growing the most is our emergency services, which is the top purple group, followed by TTC. And so that's where a lot of our spending has been happening, a lot of our investments have been made. And this chart goes back to 2007. And what we keep seeing is an increasing demand for more transit, more public safety. We are doing a lot more capital work, so we have to pay for the money that we borrow to pay for that. That's called debt servicing, much like a mortgage payment. When you go out and borrow money to buy your home, you have to pay the bank, right? So we borrow money for that. So that's having a huge pressure on our budget. Last year we had to use some one-time reserves to help with our shelter support system program. That's not in there anymore, and that's one of the key investments that this budget's making. It's stabilizing that. We had major investment last year in TTC, poverty reduction and other places, and I'll kind of give you a sense of that. So we're having to pay for the full year impact of that. And we have other capital projects, new community centers opening, and we have programming costs associated with that. On the revenue side, basically our tax revenues are not necessarily keeping pace with our labor costs. This is a bargaining year for us this year, and we'll be going into conversations about how we try to deal with that. Our assessment growth is slowing down, and as you can see, we have been relying on land transfer tax to help pay for some of our expenses. Last year was the first of a 3-year period where we had to make up money that we lost from the province. It was helping pay for our social services, so we're dealing with that pressure. And we have some funding from the other orders of government that's not very certain going forward. One is a policing grant of about $5 million. We're not sure if that's coming back. So let's talk about this year's budget. 10 billion, the councillor said 11 billion, that's true when you take in garbage and our water budgets. They're on a separate kind of schedule, so this is the budget of all the programs that we produce, that we deliver, that's based on property taxes. It's a big wheel, as you can see. The blue over on your right-hand side are all our cost-share programs, which are those programs like public health, social services, that we actually get money from the province and we are the deliverers of those programs. The red group are our emergency services, police, fire, TTC. And then if you come down to the bottom green, TTC and transportation make up a huge amount as well, about $1 billion just for TTC. And then all the other programs are showing up in the kind of beige group. And then our internal costs around borrowing for our capital, governance, which is the cost of city council, people like me in finance, our legal department, all the people that are the backbone to making sure that the operation works. And I think I've covered them all. So where does the money come from? Lots of little bits in there, but I think the key piece is the one to the top left. Property taxes make up about 39% of our money. So when we have a cost of, say, $100 to deliver a service, we maximize all the other money that we can get either from other governments, in some cases for user fees, when we charge fees for participating in a program, and then whatever's not made up, makes up the difference, comes from property tax, because municipal government has to have, by law, a balanced budget, right? Your total costs and your total revenues have to equal one another. We cannot borrow for our operations, unlike the federal and provincial government. So the discussion around what the property tax increase is really important because that closes the gap. Okay, so this year going into the budget, we're having a $426 million pressure. That means compared to last year's budget, we were seeing an increase in costs of $426 million. And that wheel kind of gives you a sense of what all the different pressures are, all the different pain points, I guess. Okay, next one. So here's another way of looking at it. So we started, here's all the different elements that get you to the 426. A couple of the key ones I just want to note is the $85 million one, the third one up. If you go to the next slide. What that is the cost of all the new investments we made last year, which were partly funded. There's about $50 million in TTC improvements that were made last year for which they were part year, so now we're paying for the rest of it so that we can operationalize it on a full year basis. And poverty reduction was a huge investment made last year, is now we're seeing that. So this year in this budget, we're seeing $85 million being invested so that we can regularize those programs that were put in place last year. Okay, so you have 426 to have a balanced budget. It means you actually have to get to the point where it balances, right? So either you have to cut some of those numbers or you have to find other options to try to get those numbers down. So what this identifies is a series of actions that we've taken to bring the budget down so that it gets to a balanced point. We've looked at budgets line by line. What does that mean? We've said, okay, how much have we spent? What are we looking for this year? Tell me why you need more, where can we cut? So we've done things, sorry, can you just go back for a sec? We've made various kinds of adjustments by looking at how we can think of other things. We have efficiency savings in there, the land transfer tax, another $100 million that we're bringing into the budget based on our actual experience. And we've put in a few other things in there about a fare increase for TTC is helping with the pressures in TTC, and some assessment growth, and then finally a few council-approved programs that are built into these numbers, but we still have a $57 million gap. Okay. One of the things that's in this budget is we are changing the rebates on our solid waste fees. One of the objectives of the city is to try to get recycling up, trying to increase our waste diversion, and what we found through audits is that in our extra large bins, 77% of what's being going into those bins can be recycled. And so we started last year down this journey of trying to get to a place where we are trying to get people to use smaller bins and to do more recycling, more repurposing, and so to make then also our solid waste function a bit more self-sufficient. So in our environmental objectives, we're trying to move people off of the large and extra large bins onto the smaller bins, and so we're using this particular approach as a way to reduce the rebates on the extra large, or eliminating on the extra large, but no change to the small bits. So we're trying to migrate people away from the reliance on the extra large and onto the small bits, and to do more recycling. Okay, so when you look at what is it that we're dealing with in terms of pressures, I said there was $57 million. So the key drivers of what's driving that $57 million is increased costs for the TTC, increased costs for police, our borrowing costs, which is all our capital that we're working on. So we're doing a lot of work in our roads, with our transit, state of good repair, opening up new community centers, libraries, so that's the borrowing costs. And then the top one is dealing with this loss of provincial funding that happened to us last year that we have to deal with over a 3-year period. So where we've landed in this budget, what we presented is that we have a $57 million change that we still have to identify to balance the budget. If you take a 1.3% tax rate increase, that leaves $23 million residual or gap, which is part of what the budget committee is dealing with. Next slide. On top of that, there's $67 million. I know it's a hard slide to look at, but there are a whole series of things that council through the year said we want you to consider in this budget. So we put it all in a hopper together, and it includes more poverty reduction, more investment to transit. The Board of Health wants certain things, the Library Board wants certain things. So we put this all together and said, okay, we need you to set the priorities on, of that $67 million, how much can we do, given that we have a $23 million pressure still, and what are really those things that give you the best impact, right? So how do you get the best value for the outcome that you want? And so part of the committee's work now and through to council will be to determine what's the right mix of those $67 million worth of asks. So when we look out 2 years, we say, okay, what do we see coming at us? So here's a long list of things in 2017, 2018 that we see as expenditure pressure. So, you know, you've heard about TTC getting a Presto card, but guess what? We have to pay somebody the administration fee to manage that. It's $51 million. That's coming at us next year, for example, right? So there's lots of things on this list that we can talk about later, but right now it's $400 million on expenditures in year 1, another $300 million in the following year. When you take into consideration some other revenues that we get in, and we say, okay, you take those two things together, about $30 million or more revenue only that we've seen for 17, and when you add some assessment growth, then we're still at about a $400 million pressure coming at us next year. That's based on no change in service levels, right? So nothing new being added yet, and whatever impact that has in the following year. Okay, so that was operating really quickly. So now capital, which is the budget that we use to maintain our assets in a state of good repair, because you can't have service without the assets to deliver them, right? So you don't have this building, you can't have the programming in it unless it's being maintained. So we put a lot of money into that, and there's certain kinds of things that we have to think about when we think about how we budget for our capital programs. So the first thing is, only on capital are we allowed to actually borrow money. And we have to set a limit on our own to try to impose some fiscal discipline about what value we can borrow. So when you go to a bank and say, I want to get a mortgage, they'll say, okay, what's your income? And your payment shouldn't be any more than X% of your income. So for us, it's 15% of our property tax income. So we use that as kind of our cap on what we can borrow annually, because we have to pay for that in our operating budget. The higher that repayment is in our operating, the less money that's actually going to services, right? So we always have this trade-off of things that we need to do. So our 10-year cap, it's $21 billion over a 10-year period. For 1 year, it's about $2 billion, so it's roughly 1/10 of that. Most of it going to transit and to transportation. The investment in those two areas are huge, but we also have money in our libraries, our community centers and such. On the right-hand side is how we fund it. And you can see the kinds of projects that we do. The biggest, which is that ring to your left, state of good repair. So that's making sure 68% of it is going to make sure that our assets are maintained in a state of good repair. The rest of the money deals with improving service, as well as trying to ensure that we're accommodating growth where there's been increased demand because of population change. Okay, so next slide. This is just a summary of numbers that says, you know, over 10 years, where's the money going and so on. Overall, when we compared what we can afford to borrow based on what we established debt targets, we're about $600 million over what we had planned on doing. Mostly going to the TTC to help fund, most of it going to transportation actually, because we're trying to fund the Gardner Expressway change. There's been a lot of debate about, you know, the east side of the Gardner and how we're going to manage that going forward. So there's been a lot of debate this year. So that's where most of that is going. Okay, next slide. And one of the things that we track as we go through this is making sure that we're keeping up with the State of Good Repair program. And most governments have what they call an infrastructure deficit, which is they're not keeping up with the repairs. And so we monitor our performance on our State of Good Repair backlog. That means those kinds of projects that we haven't had the money to do. And so we monitor how our investments over the 10 years are impacting the State of Good Repair backlog. And so right now we've stabilized. So what that is doing is showing the red line is kind of the backlog, and then as a percentage of our asset value. We have $78 billion worth of assets. So it's quite a big inventory of things we have to manage. So while we're not going down in all areas, in a couple areas we are, parks, forestry, and recreation is one. We're seeing some going up as well. One of our latest challenges is dealing with ensuring that our buildings are all compliant with the provincial legislation for accommodation. So that's an area that we're putting some money into. And that's it by program. So transportation roads is a big problem. Our local roads, even though we've invested over $1.3 billion, it continues to be an issue. Okay, next slide. So where does the money come from? Well, we try to get as much money from the provincial and federal governments, but they're more project specific. Down into the left, capital from current, we actually have money in our operating budget that we contribute to paying for our capital, kind of like if you had a savings account. So you're not borrowing all the time or using your credit card, you're actually using some cash. So we try to balance the amount of cash that we're using with the amount that we're borrowing. And so debt, which is in the bottom, is about 21%, capital from current is 22%, so about 43% we're trying to do through our own sources after we've maximized other sources. Because it's a balancing game that we have of trying to make sure that we can fund this all in a prudent and responsible way, but still meeting the needs of the city and all of our services. Okay, so debt is a big thing for us and how much we're borrowing because it impacts a whole bunch of things. So most of our debt is going to transportation and then to TTC. Even though we've put so much money, those are our two major drivers of debt. They continue to still need more. And I'll show you the slide in a few minutes, but that's kind of an order with our facilities and parks, forestry, and recreation. IT is an area because we are trying to transform our businesses and get efficiencies and be more effective in our service delivery. We're putting more money into that. So when we look at borrowing, then we think, okay, how much do we have to issue? So this 10-year capital plan says in these years, we have to borrow X number of dollars. Okay, and then we say, okay, when we look at that, are we staying to that 15% cap? Well, we're just at 14.87. So we have kind of maxed out. Next slide. We have a non-debt financing strategy, which is using other sources of money that's non-debt. So if we have underspending at the end of a year, we're putting that into a capital financing reserve. That is dedicated towards actual projects. $2 billion of what's going on in the capital plan is being funded by non-debt items. That's helping augment or supplement our ability so we can maintain our affordability. Okay, but we have a long list, about $23 billion of projects that are unfunded. These are all things that somewhere council has discussed, there's work being done, there's been some direction on it, and they include things around TTC expansion. They include work on the waterfront. They include some of the TTC basic state of good repair. There's a long line, there's a long list here, we can talk more, including, the social housing that we have not funded, right? If you were to borrow for it all, that red line would take us way over the 15%, which we just cannot afford. We just can't do that. So it's a huge gap, and it's something that we're going to be talking about in terms of how we look at other tools to help that. So, we would have, if we had to borrow for all of it, it would equal about 1.7 billion in debt charges. We're at about 400 million at the moment. So this is an area of challenge for the city coming up in the following year. Another area of priorities that need to be set. So lots going on. We're going to have to evaluate revenue options for 17 and beyond. That looks at development financing, maybe higher debt, capital levies, asset sales, and maybe other revenue tools. So while I know there's a discussion to be had about revenue tools on operating, we also need to think about our capital program because there's some very key things happening in there. So just quickly on the budget process slide, so this is kind of a map that shows you what with all the steps that we go through. We're kind of at the end part where budget committee is meeting down in the last of the 3 boxes there. Next slide. We have a website that has lots of information to help engage you. Very detailed information, division by division, agency by agency, and you can get the story of what's going on in each of those budgets. And the schedule has us right now sitting at budget committee meetings as a 3rd line. We've done 2 days. We're back tomorrow and then on Monday. Monday evening, we actually have a user fee town hall meeting. There's an education session. And then next week are public deputations at 6 different civic centers on the 12th, 13th, and 14th. And then we wrap up filing with council on February 17th.